Doris had spent most of her life in and out of hospitals, battling a mysterious illness that had plagued her since childhood. By the time she turned 32, the sickness had become a constant companion, a shadow over what should have been the prime years of her life. The illness defied all treatments, leaving doctors baffled and Doris resigned to a life defined by pain and limitations. While her friends pursued careers, built families, and traveled the world, Doris watched life pass her by from sterile hospital rooms. On March 21st, 2024, Doris was admitted to the hospital once again. Her condition had worsened, and she found herself confined to a bed, her body weak, but her mind sharp. As the world buzzed with excitement for the 2024 Olympics, Doris clung to one of the few joys she had left watching the opening ceremony. Despite her frailty, she was eager to experience the grandeur and unity that such events promised, even if only through a screen. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith. The ceremony began with dazzling performances, an explosion of color and sound that momentarily lifted Doris's spirits. She marveled at the artistry, feeling a glimmer of hope as she watched the world come together in celebration. But as the event unfolded, an unsettling feeling crept over her. At first, she dismissed it as a side effect of her medication or the toll of her illness. But the unease grew stronger with each passing moment. One particular performance caught her attention. A man, painted entirely in blue, took the stage, surrounded by a group of performers. At first, it seemed like an abstract, artistic display, creative and modern. But as Doris watched, the scene began to shift. The man's outstretched arms and solemn expression became unmistakably familiar, a portrayal of Christ. His followers mimicked scenes from the Gospels, reenacting moments like the Last Supper, but something was deeply off. The reverence that should have accompanied such a portrayal was missing, replaced by a mocking tone that felt sacrilegious. The blue paint, once an artistic flourish, now seemed like a deliberate attempt to cheapen something sacred. The audience applauded, seemingly unaware of the underlying disrespect. Doris's heart sank. This wasn't just a performance, it felt like a direct affront to her faith, a mockery of Christ's life and sacrifice. As the ceremony continued, Doris could no longer enjoy the spectacle. What began as a celebration of human achievement had taken on a darker undertone, one that left her feeling isolated and disheartened. She wanted to turn off the television, but her body was too weak to reach for the remote. All she could do was lie there, consumed by the weight of what she had witnessed. The next morning, during visiting hours, Doris's two sisters arrived to keep her company. They brought her small comforts, flowers, snacks, and cheerful chatter about the ceremony. They laughed about the performances, sharing their favorite moments. But Doris couldn't bring herself to join in. Her body was too drained to form words, her thoughts too heavy to express. She listened in silence, her unease deepening as her sisters continued their light-hearted discussion. She wanted to tell them how wrong it all felt, how the performance had struck her as a blatant mockery of Christ. But the effort was too great, and her voice remained trapped inside her. All she could do was pray silently, asking for strength and clarity. What had begun as a night of spectacle and joy had turned into a moment of profound spiritual unrest, and Doris couldn't shake the feeling that something far greater was at play. That evening, as the room grew quiet and the bustle of the hospital subsided, Doris found herself alone with her thoughts. She replayed the performance in her mind, trying to make sense of her reaction. Was she overthinking it? Or was there a deeper meaning behind her unease? As the clock ticked toward nightfall, she felt a growing heaviness in her chest, not just from her illness, but from an unshakable sense that she was on the brink of something extraordinary. As the night deepened, Doris remained awake, her body too frail and her mind too restless to allow her any peace. The performance from the previous evening continued to play in her thoughts like a haunting melody, each image more vivid than the last. She tried to pray, seeking solace in her faith, but even her prayers felt weighed down by an invisible burden. Every breath she took felt labored, her chest tight and her strength waning. The room, illuminated by the faint glow of the medical monitors, seemed colder and lonelier than ever. A little before 10 p.m., the symptoms intensified. Her heart began to race, pounding erratically in her chest as if struggling to keep her tethered to life. A suffocating tightness formed in her throat, and her breaths became shallow and strained. Panic set in as Doris realized she was fighting for air, her hands instinctively reaching for the call button to summon help. But her body betrayed her. Her fingers trembled weakly. Unable to press the button, the room started to blur, spinning in and out of focus, and a cold sweat broke out on her clammy skin. Doris felt herself slipping away. The sound of the monitors faded, replaced by an overwhelming silence. Just as the edges of her vision dimmed into darkness, she saw something or someone in the room. At first, it was just a shadow, barely distinguishable in the dim light. But the figure grew clearer with each passing moment, emerging from the wall as though it had no physical boundaries. Her fear gave way to astonishment as she realized the figure was not of this world. Standing at the foot of her bed was a man. He was tall, with a presence that filled the room, radiating both authority and gentleness. His face was unlike any she had ever seen, calm, serene, and glowing with a light that seemed to come from within. His eyes were deep and piercing, filled with an unfathomable wisdom and compassion that made her feel both vulnerable and understood. He didn't speak, but his gaze communicated volumes, as if he could see every moment of her life, every thought she had ever held. Doris wanted to ask who he was, but her voice failed her. She tried to move, but her body remained still. Despite her frailty, she felt no fear, only a profound sense of awe and reassurance. The man extended his hand toward her, his palm open and inviting. Without thinking, Doris reached out. Her hand, weak and trembling, found strength in that moment, and as their fingers touched, a surge of warmth coursed through her. It wasn't the warmth of physical heat, but a profound sense of connection, as though her very soul was being steadied and uplifted. In an instant, the hospital room vanished. The sterile walls, the beeping monitors, even her own physical sensations dissolved into nothingness. Doris found herself standing on solid ground in a vast, unfamiliar landscape. She was no longer confined to her frail body. Her spirit felt weightless yet present, as though she existed in a form beyond the physical. The air was heavy with an indescribable stillness, a silence that carried the weight of something sacred. Before her stood the replica statue of Liberty of Paris, a sight she recognized immediately. But the statue was not as it should have been. Its towering form was shattered, broken into jagged pieces that lay scattered across the ground. The sight filled her with an overwhelming sense of loss and dread. Around her, the landscape began to shift, morphing into scenes of chaos and despair. Doris saw two armies facing each other in a desolate battlefield. The clash of weapons and the cries of the wounded filled the air, a cacophony of destruction. Soldiers advanced relentlessly, their faces hardened with resolve. But what struck Doris most were the children, small, fragile figures in the midst of the conflict, wielding weapons far too large for their hands. Their eyes, devoid of innocence, reflected a cold determination that was unnatural for their age. Women, too, were armed, their faces etched with the same hardened resolve as the soldiers. The devastation was total. Buildings crumbled, smoke filled the air, and the ground itself seemed to groan under the weight of the chaos. Doris wanted to cry out, to ask why she was being shown such a horrifying scene. But no words came. The man who had brought her there stood silently beside her, his expression unreadable, but his presence unwavering. From above, the sky darkened, and a massive hand began to descend. It was unlike anything Doris had ever seen, vast and powerful, covering the heavens with an aura of authority. The hand moved deliberately, touching the earth with a force that made the ground tremble beneath her feet. The moment it made contact, water surged from the ground, a torrent so immense it defied comprehension. The floodwaters rose rapidly, consuming everything in their path. Streets, buildings, and people were swept away in an unstoppable wave. As the water rose higher, Doris realized the city being consumed was Paris. The landmarks, the streets, even the fragments of the fallen statue all confirmed it. Paris was being swallowed whole, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Amidst the destruction, a new presence descended from the heavens. A mighty angel, vast and radiant, touched the earth. His form was so immense that Doris couldn't gauge his full height. The moment his feet touched the ground, the earth quaked violently, splitting open as tremors rippled outward. Buildings collapsed, and the land itself seemed to shudder under the angel's presence. This was not merely a natural disaster, it was a divine intervention, a judgment. Doris could feel the weight of it in her very soul, an overwhelming sense that she was witnessing something far beyond human comprehension. The angel's presence was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a manifestation of power that left no room for doubt. The man beside her finally spoke, his voice calm yet filled with authority. "What you see is an impending judgment," he said. "God cannot be mocked." The words resonated deeply within Doris, confirming what she had felt during the opening ceremony. The destruction she witnessed was not random, it was a direct consequence of the mockery of God during the event. Doris felt a profound sorrow for the people of Paris, for the devastation that awaited them if they did not turn back to God. The man's voice softened, carrying a tone of hope. "But know this, God's mercy is boundless. If the people of Paris repent and amend their ways, there is still hope. God is just, but he is also merciful. Redemption is always possible for those who seek it." Doris looked at the angel, the floodwaters, and the ruined city, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had seen. Yet amidst the destruction, the promise of mercy shone like a distant light, a reminder that even in judgment, grace was never out of reach. Doris found herself standing in the midst of a city consumed by chaos. The floodwaters continued to rise, swallowing everything in their path with an unstoppable force. Landmarks crumbled, and once vibrant streets were reduced to murky depths. The cries of the people echoed around her, a chorus of desperation and fear that cut through her soul. She wanted to reach out, to help in some way, but her body remained frozen, unable to interact with the scene before her. The angel, standing tall and radiant, moved with purpose. Each step he took shook the ground beneath him, his presence undeniable. Doris watched as he raised his hand, a gesture that seemed to command both the waters and the earth. The flood began to recede slightly, leaving behind destruction and desolation. Yet, despite the devastation, there was a strange stillness in the air, as if the earth itself was holding its breath in anticipation. The man who had guided Doris stood beside her, his expression calm but resolute. "This is the result of a city that has turned away," he said, his voice steady. "Paris mocked God, and now judgment has come. Yet, even amidst this, there is still a chance for redemption." Doris wanted to speak, to ask why she had been brought here, why she was the one witnessing these events. But before she could form the words, the scene around her shifted again. The floodwaters disappeared entirely, replaced by a barren wasteland. The city of Paris was unrecognizable, its streets cracked, its buildings reduced to rubble. The air was thick with the stench of ash and smoke, and the sky above was a dark, oppressive gray. In the distance, Doris saw figures moving among the ruins. At first, she thought they were survivors, but as they came closer, she realized they were unlike any people she had ever seen. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and their movements unnatural. They carried with them an aura of despair, as though they were the embodiment of the city's downfall. Children wandered aimlessly, their innocence replaced by a haunting emptiness. Women and men, once full of life, now seemed like shadows of themselves, burdened by the weight of what had been lost. Doris's heart ached for them, for the hopelessness that seemed to cling to their every step. She wanted to cry out, to tell them that it wasn't too late, that they could still turn back. But her voice failed her once again. The angel, still towering above the ruins, spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and resonant, carrying both authority and sorrow. "This is what becomes of a people who mock the sacred, who turn their backs on truth and righteousness. But know this, even in the midst of destruction, God's mercy remains. His justice is true, but his forgiveness is boundless for those who seek it with humility and repentance. As the angel spoke, the dark sky began to change. A light broke through the clouds, faint at first but growing steadily brighter. The figures in the ruins stopped and turned toward the light, their hollow eyes reflecting a glimmer of hope. Doris felt a warmth in her chest, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, redemption was possible. The man beside Doris placed a hand on her shoulder, drawing her attention away from the scene. His touch was gentle but firm, grounding her in the moment. "Do you understand why you are here?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet urgency. Doris shook her head, still overwhelmed by what she had witnessed. "No," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "Why me? Why am I seeing this?" "You were chosen," the man replied. "Your heart is open, and your spirit is willing. You have seen the truth, and now you must share it. This is not just a warning for Paris, it is a message for all who have turned away, for all who have forgotten the sacredness of life and the grace of God." Doris felt the weight of his words settle over her, a responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. "But what can I do?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I'm just one person. How can I make a difference?" The man's gaze softened, and he smiled gently. "You are not alone. The truth you carry is powerful, and the message you share will resonate with those who are ready to hear it. Have faith, Doris. Your voice will reach those who need it most." Before she could respond, the scene around her shifted once more. The ruins of Paris faded away, replaced by a vision of the city as it once was alive, bustling, and full of promise. The streets were filled with people going about their lives, unaware of the looming judgment. Doris felt a pang of longing for the world she saw, a world that still had a chance to change. The man turned to her one final time. "This is their choice to make," he said. "Pray for them, Doris. Pray for their hearts to soften, for their spirits to turn back to God. And when you return, share what you have seen. The time is short, but the opportunity for redemption is vast." With those words, the light around Doris began to intensify, enveloping her in its warmth. She felt herself being pulled away from the vision, back to the hospital room where her journey had begun. As the light faded, she found herself lying in her bed once more, the familiar hum of medical equipment filling the air. Her body was weak, but her spirit was ablaze. The weight of what she had seen and heard pressed heavily on her heart, but so too did the urgency to act. Doris knew that her experience had not been a dream or a figment of her imagination. It was a call, a divine commission to share the truth and to intercede for those who had strayed. She closed her eyes, her heart filled with both sorrow and hope, and whispered a prayer into the silence of the night. Doris lay still in her hospital bed, her heart racing with the weight of everything she had witnessed. The vision was as vivid as if it had truly happened, and the man's words echoed in her mind. "Pray for them. Share what you have seen. The time is short, but the opportunity for redemption is vast." Though her body was weak, her spirit felt ignited by an urgency she had never known before. As the night wore on, she reflected on the scenes of devastation and judgment she had been shown. The broken Statue of Liberty replica in Paris, the rising floodwaters, and the towering angel with his resounding declaration all were etched into her memory. But what haunted her most were the faces of the people, the hollow-eyed children, the women armed with weapons, and the men consumed by despair. Each face seemed to carry a story, a life disrupted by choices and consequences beyond their understanding. The following day, Doris struggled to regain her strength. Nurses came and went, performing their usual routines, oblivious to the spiritual battle she was processing internally. Her sisters visited again, bringing the usual cheerfulness, but Doris was too consumed by her thoughts to fully engage. She could no longer keep the experience to herself. It wasn't just a vision for her own reflection, it was a warning, a call to action, and she felt compelled to share it. When her sisters sat beside her, talking softly about everyday matters, Doris finally mustered the courage to speak. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice weak but firm. Her sisters turned to her, concern flickering across their faces. "What is it, Doris?" one of them asked. Leaning in closer, Doris took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. Last night, I had a vision, or maybe it was something more. I don't know how to explain it, but I saw things I can't ignore. She paused, searching for the right words. It was about Paris, about judgment, and about God. Her sisters exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. What did you see? The other sister asked cautiously. Doris recounted every detail, from the moment the man appeared in her hospital room to the devastating scenes of Paris's destruction. She described the angel, the floodwaters, the shattered statue, and the man's solemn declaration, "God cannot be mocked." Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she didn't leave anything out. By the time she finished, her sisters were silent, their faces pale with the weight of her words. "That's intense," one of them finally said, struggling to process it all. "Are you sure it wasn't just a dream? Maybe the medications?" "It wasn't a dream," Doris interrupted, her voice firmer now. "I know what I saw. It was real, and it was a warning not just for Paris, but for all of us." Her other sister nodded slowly, her brow furrowed in thought. "If this is true, Doris, then what are we supposed to do? How can we make a difference?" Doris's eyes filled with tears. "We have to pray. We have to ask God for mercy, not just for Paris, but for everyone who's turned away from him. And we have to share this message, even if people don't want to hear it." Her sisters sat in contemplative silence for a moment. Then one of them reached out and took Doris's hand. "We'll pray with you," she said softly. "We'll help you share this, if that's what you feel called to do." Encouraged by their support, Doris felt a renewed sense of determination. She knew the task ahead would not be easy. Many would dismiss her vision as fantasy or exaggeration, but she also knew she couldn't remain silent. The man's words had been clear. The time for repentance was now, and the opportunity for redemption was still within reach. Over the next few days, Doris began to share her story with others. Nurses, visitors, and even her doctor heard snippets of her experience as she spoke with quiet conviction. Some listened intently, their expressions thoughtful, while others brushed it off politely, offering words of encouragement without fully engaging. Doris didn't let the mixed reactions deter her. Her responsibility wasn't to convince everyone, it was simply to speak the truth and let God do the rest. One evening, as Doris lay reflecting on the responses she had received, she thought back to the man's final words, "The truth you carry is powerful, and the message you share will resonate with those who are ready to hear it." It reminded her that her role was not to force belief, but to plant seeds, trusting that they would grow in their own time. In her prayers that night, Doris asked God for strength and clarity. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't know why you chose me, but I trust your purpose. Please guide me as I share this message, and let it reach the hearts that need it most." Her prayer was met with a profound sense of peace, as though the weight of her burden had been momentarily lifted. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. The next day, Doris received an unexpected visitor, an old friend she hadn't seen in years. The friend, hearing of Doris's illness, had come to offer support and comfort. As they talked, Doris felt a nudge in her spirit to share her vision once more. Hesitant at first, she eventually recounted her experience, watching as her friend's expression shifted from curiosity to deep reflection. When Doris finished, her friend sat quietly for a moment, then said, "Doris, what you're describing, it reminds me of something I've been struggling with. I've felt so disconnected from God lately, like I've been running in the wrong direction." Hearing this, it feels like a wake-up call. Tears filled Doris's eyes as she realized that her story had already begun to touch lives. Her vision wasn't just a warning of judgment, it was also a beacon of hope, calling people back to God's mercy and grace. As the days passed, she continued to share her message, each conversation strengthening her resolve. She knew the task was far from over, but for the first time, she felt truly alive, her spirit empowered by the truth she carried. Doris awoke the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of her vision still lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it was a calling, She had begun to understand that sharing her experience was less about convincing others and more about being obedient to the mission she had been given. As the days passed, word of Doris's vision spread among her family and friends. Some approached her out of genuine curiosity, while others came with skepticism, searching for flaws in her story. Doris faced each conversation with patience and grace, knowing that not everyone would understand. She didn't expect immediate transformation. She simply hoped that the seed she planted would one day grow. Her sisters, who had been her first confidants, became her strongest allies. They joined her in prayer each evening, lifting up not only Paris but all the cities and nations that had turned away from God. Together, they prayed for humility, repentance, and a return to the sacred. Their voices, though small in the grand scheme of the world, carried a conviction that felt unshakable. Doris found herself reflecting often on the final moments of her vision, the angel, the flood, and the words of the man who had guided her. "God cannot be mocked," he had said, a statement that resonated deeply. Yet what struck her most was his emphasis on mercy, a reminder that even in the face of judgment, God's love remained steadfast. It was this balance of justice and mercy that gave her hope, and it became the cornerstone of the message she shared with others. One day, Doris received a letter from a woman who had heard her story through a mutual acquaintance. The woman, a resident of Paris, described how she had watched the Olympic ceremony with the same unease that Doris had felt. She hadn't been able to articulate it at the time, but Doris's account had brought clarity to her feelings. "Your vision shook me," the woman wrote. "It made me realize how far I've drifted from my faith. I've begun praying again, and I want to thank you for being brave enough to share what you saw." The letter brought Doris to tears. She hadn't expected to hear from anyone directly impacted by her story, and it reminded her that her efforts were not in vain. Though she might never know the full extent of her influence, she took comfort in the knowledge that even one heart had been moved to change. As Doris continued to recover physically, her spiritual resolve only grew stronger. She began journaling her thoughts and experiences, hoping that her writings might one day reach even more people. Her entries were filled with reflections on the vision, prayers for the world, and reminders of God's boundless mercy. She knew that her words alone could never capture the enormity of what she had witnessed, but she trusted that God would use them in ways she couldn't foresee. One evening, as she sat by her hospital window watching the sunset, Doris felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, a reminder of the beauty and hope that still existed in the world. She closed her eyes and prayed silently, thanking God for the strength to carry out her mission and for the moments of grace that sustained her along the way. In the days that followed, Doris began receiving more letters and visits from people who had been touched by her story. Some shared their own struggles with faith, while others simply expressed gratitude for her courage. Each interaction reinforced her belief that her vision had been more than a warning, it had been a call to awaken hearts and bring people back to God's mercy. As her discharge from the hospital approached, Doris felt a bittersweet mixture of relief and anticipation. She was eager to leave the confines of the hospital and return to the world, but she also knew that her journey was far from over. The vision had changed her, not just in spirit, but in purpose. She was no longer the woman who had watched life pass her by from a hospital bed. She was now a vessel for a message greater than herself. On her last night in the hospital, Doris sat with her sisters, reflecting on everything that had happened since the vision. "Do you think people will really listen?" she asked, her voice tinged with vulnerability. Her eldest sister placed a hand on hers. "Whether they listen or not isn't up to you, Doris. What matters is that you've been faithful to what God called you to do. The rest is in His hands." Those words stayed with Doris as she stepped out of the hospital the next morning, the sun shining brightly on her face. She breathed deeply, her body still weak but her spirit stronger than ever. The world before her was the same one she had left, but she saw it through new eyes filled with both the urgency of the message she carried and the hope of redemption that remained. In the days, months, and years that followed, Doris continued to share her story. She spoke in small gatherings, wrote letters to those who reached out, and even recorded her experiences for those who couldn't meet her in person. Her words traveled farther than she ever imagined, touching lives in places she had never been. And while Doris never returned to the physical landscape of her vision, its images and lessons remained with her always. She carried the weight of the angel's declaration, the hope of the descending light, and the man's words of mercy as a reminder of the delicate balance between judgment and grace. Her life became a testament to the power of obedience and faith, a beacon for those seeking their way back to God. In her quiet moments, Doris often thought of Paris, the city she had seen brought to ruin and then offered a chance for redemption. She prayed daily for its people, believing wholeheartedly in the possibility of change. For Doris, the vision had been a warning, but it had also been a promise that no matter how far one strayed, the path to God's mercy was always open. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith.